Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40, where SpaceX is preparing to launch their third Falcon 9 mission in about 31 hours with two Intelsat TV broadcast satellites on board. Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 are the payloads for this evening's mission. SpaceX's Falcon 9 is vertical on pad 40. As you can see, it was raised vertical very early this morning in preparation for tonight's launch window, which opens at 7:07 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 23:07 UTC. And SpaceX has a 67-minute, 1 hour, 7-minute launch window this evening that runs until 8:14 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 12:14 a.m. UTC. So unlike most SpaceX missions, such as those with Starlink satellites or those heading to the International Space Station, SpaceX has a bit of a longer window this evening, with no issues to concern themselves about docking with another object in space or targeting a specific orbital plane in low Earth orbit. There is a little bit of flexibility in the timeline this evening. The launch window opens in about an hour and 5 minutes. Again, the launch window opens at 7:07 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:07 UTC. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of SpaceflightNow.com. I'll be providing commentary throughout the remainder of the countdown this evening, as well as the Falcon 9's flight into orbit. It's about 38 minutes from the time of liftoff until the second of these two Intelsat communication satellites deploys from the upper stage of the Falcon 9 in orbit. As I mentioned, this is going to be the third Falcon 9 launch by SpaceX in 31 hours. This fast-paced series of launches began at noon Eastern Time yesterday with the launch of the Crew 5 mission to the International Space Station. We just saw the Crew 5 capsule, the Crew Dragon Endurance spacecraft that launched yesterday at noon Eastern Time from Kennedy Space Center, arrive at the International Space Station. It docked at the station about an hour ago, shortly after 5 p.m. Eastern Time, to deliver 4 new crew members to the orbiting research outpost. They're beginning a 5-month research expedition aboard the station. And then at 7:10 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 hours after the crew launch yesterday, SpaceX launched a Falcon 9 rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with 52 Starlink Internet satellites on board. That was another successful launch for the Starlink Internet network, and roughly 24 hours later now, SpaceX is set to launch another Falcon 9 with the Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 communication satellites. This is, if the Falcon 9 launches tonight, this will be the quickest turnaround between 3 Falcon 9 missions from 3 separate pads in SpaceX's history, and we believe it's the quickest series of 3 launches, fastest series of 3 launches ever accomplished by any commercial launch company in the space age. So quite an impressive cadence of launches by SpaceX, 3 in 31 hours. If you've been watching our launch coverage, you'll also know that United Launch Alliance launched an Atlas V rocket from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station back on Tuesday evening, about 48 hours ago. So including that launch, that's 4 major U.S. space launches in 48 hours or so, a little over 48 hours, and 3 launches on 3 consecutive days here on Florida's Space Coast. SpaceX has just confirmed a new target launch time. If you've been watching the clock in the upper right of our screen, you'll know that that clock is now ticking to a launch time of 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:20 UTC. We're not sure the reason for this delay, but it's just a 13-minute change in the launch time. Again, as I mentioned at the start of our broadcast, there is a 67-minute launch window available tonight for SpaceX, and SpaceX has elected to use some of that window and is now targeting 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time for this launch. That is 23:20 UTC. The weather conditions here on Florida Space Coast are pretty much ideal for a launch this evening, with some light to breezy winds, but well below any constraint for a rocket launch. Almost perfectly clear skies. There is a nearly full moon that has risen off on the eastern horizon in the last hour or so. It rose actually right behind pad 40 from our vantage point. It is now above and to the right of the launch pad. A gorgeous evening for a launch here at Cape Canaveral. This will be the 44th space launch attempt of the year from Florida Space Coast. That includes missions from launch pads over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and at Kennedy Space Center. The view you're looking at right now is from our camera site at Kennedy Space Center, about 4 miles west of pad 40. You can see the 229-foot tall or 70-meter Falcon 9 rocket vertical out there, awaiting launch in an hour and 9 minutes, less than an hour and 9 minutes now, with these two dual-stacked geostationary communications satellites for Intelsat. The launch this evening will occur about 15 minutes or so after sunset here at Cape Canaveral, and it could put on quite a show with these clear skies and excellent visibility as the rocket climbs into sunlight a few moments after launch. The exhaust plume from the Merlin engines could be illuminated quite brightly against a dark sky and produce what many know as the jellyfish effect that we often see at twilight launches, either happening just after dusk or just before dawn. And all the elements are in place for another show like that this evening. If you're just joining us, you're continuing to look at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40, where SpaceX has a Falcon 9 rocket vertical, now an hour and 5 minutes and 20 seconds from liftoff time. If you're just joining us also, and you haven't had a chance to do so, please click the like button on our stream. That really helps us gain a larger following and a bigger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this launch, which could be a really spectacular one, to as many people as possible this evening. So please hit the like button if you haven't already done so. Now 1 hour 5 minutes till launch of Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34, two C-band communications satellites for Intelsat. While we're waiting for the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket with uh, Intelsat's Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites, we talked about the Crew 5 mission a few moments ago. It launched yesterday at noon Eastern Time from Pad 39A here at Kennedy Space Center with a crew of 4 heading to the International Space Station. About an hour before we went on air with our broadcast, we were covering the docking of the Crew 5 mission to the International Space Station. This is a replay of that operation that occurred about an hour and a half ago. Docking occurred exactly at 5:01 p.m. Eastern Time, or 21:01 UTC, to complete a 29-hour transit from liftoff here at Kennedy Space Center until the Crew Dragon Endurance spacecraft, owned by SpaceX, linked up with the space station's Harmony module. You can see here a replay of that docking. The nose cone of the Dragon spacecraft, which opened shortly after launch to reveal the docking mechanism. And that docking mechanism is where the Dragon spacecraft connected up to the docking adapter on the Harmony node module of the space station. If you look closely, you can see a few flashes around the circumference of that capsule. Those are the Draco thrusters controlling the Dragon spacecraft's final approach to the space station. This is all an automated procedure. There's no crew input during this time frame, during this operation. It's a fully automated docking. The docking approach occurs at a velocity, a relative velocity to the space station of about 10 centimeters per second. That's less than a quarter mile per hour during this final phase of approach and docking. If you look inside that nose cone hatch at the nose of the spacecraft, you can actually see the lights on inside the capsule where the 4 crew members were sitting for this docking. Commander Nicole Mann, pilot Josh Cassada, mission specialists Koichi Wakata and Anna Kikina on board. And there's the moment of contact and soft capture with the Crew Dragon docking mechanism connecting to the docking adapter on the Harmony module of the International Space Station. Again, this docking occurred at 5:01 p.m., about an hour and a half ago, Eastern Time, as the space station sailed over the Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Africa. And here's a live view now provided by NASA TV, showing on the left of this inset, you can see a view from a camera inside the Dragon Endurance spacecraft looking into the space station. And on the right, you can see a view from the space station's Harmony module, where the space station crew is ready to greet the new arrivals. This docking temporarily raised the size of the space station crew to 11 people. This 4-person crew capsule, the crew that just arrived, is replacing the Crew 4 astronauts who have been up there since late April. And those Crew 4 astronauts are scheduled to return home in their Dragon Freedom spacecraft, a different Dragon capsule, as soon as next week to wrap up their long-duration expedition. And that will leave the space station with its long-term crew complement of 7 astronauts and cosmonauts. So we're happy to bring you that replay of the docking of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft at the International Space Station earlier this evening. We were covering that live on spaceflightnow.com. So if you want to watch some coverage like that, you can go to our homepage, spaceflightnow.com. Of course, we're streaming tonight's launch because it's happening here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. So we are here and equipped with gear to bring you this live stream, this live broadcast of this Falcon 9 launch this evening, which is now less than 50 minutes away, 48 minutes, 36 seconds to be exact, from the launch scheduled for 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:20 UTC. Again, this SpaceX Falcon 9 that we're going to see launched this evening is carrying 2 Intelsat communications satellites into orbit. We're now inside of 45 minutes until tonight's current targeted launch time of 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:20 UTC. Again, the launch window tonight actually opens at 7:07 p.m. SpaceX, a bit earlier this evening, pushed back that target launch time by 13 minutes. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 with Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 is now scheduled for 7:20 p.m. Eastern. In about 10 minutes, we should hear confirmation from SpaceX of the start of propellant loading on board the Falcon 9. That liquid propellant loading is due to get underway at T-minus 35 minutes.
On Countdown.net, reminder, propellant load and launch go-no-go poll is open for rebuy at this time. Step 5972, looking for buys from mission manager, ground stations, and launch controller.
Now inside of 40 minutes until tonight's scheduled launch time of 7:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 23:20 UTC. There, if you look closely, you just saw a Coast Guard helicopter pass offshore behind the launch pad. This is part of the standard pre-launch security sweep. If you've watched our coverage of launches this week or any time in the last few months to few years, you'll likely have seen these helicopters make their security passes behind the launch pad. They're making sure that the airspace as well as the maritime area, the waters off the shore, off the coast of the spaceport here, are all clear of unauthorized vessels, unauthorized airplanes. That's part of the range safety requirement. The eastern range here at Cape Canaveral requires a clear range in order to give the green light for any rocket launch originating from here at KSC or at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Now inside of T-minus 39 minutes and counting. We're less than 4 minutes now from the start of propellant loading. At this time, SpaceX launch controllers at the control center just south of the Space Force Station near Port Canaveral should be going through their pre-launch poll, their readiness poll, to make sure that all the engineers and all the management team inside that control center are ready to proceed with propellant loading tonight. And at this point, they'll also give their go or no-go for launch. This is the last readiness poll before liftoff. This is an electronic poll. It's not conducted by voice communication as some other launch operators perform their pre-launch polls. This is an electronic poll, and the controllers and console operators report their status.
Complete. We're go for propellant load and launch.
There's the launch director giving confirmation that the poll is complete and teams are go for launch, and presumably that means they're go for propellant load, which is set to begin in less than 3 minutes. Again, if you're just joining us, so we're at T-minus 37 minutes and 5 seconds. In a couple of minutes, we should be at the point of propellant load on the Falcon 9. That's when SpaceX will begin loading about 1 million pounds of liquid oxygen and kerosene propellants.
Falcon 9 tanks are venting for propellant load.
That call from launch control.
A reminder on abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief CE or LD and they'll approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into launch abort auto. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Launch auto sequence has started.
T-minus 35 minutes and counting. That call, launch auto sequence has started, came from SpaceX Launch Control. And right now the countdown is running on the automated sequencer for the final 35 minutes of the countdown. And this is also the point at which propellants begin flowing into the Falcon 9 launch vehicle out on pad 40. About 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants will be loaded into the vehicle over the next 30 minutes or so. The loading will be terminated at about T-minus 2 minutes. That's when the final propellants will be loaded into the vehicle and the fill and drain valves will be closed. And at that point, SpaceX will have a fully loaded vehicle for launch at 7:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 23:20 UTC. Again, this launch tonight occurring about 15 to 20 minutes after sunset here on Florida Space Coast. It could be a spectacular show. If you're here in the local area, it's worth taking a look as the Falcon 9 climbs into clear skies over Cape Canaveral, heading due east with these two Intelsat communications satellites on board. T-minus 33 minutes, 18 seconds. If you're just joining us and you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit that like button on our YouTube stream. It helps us gain a bigger audience for what we expect to be one of the most spectacular launches of the year just after sunset here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. So please hit the like button if you haven't had a chance to do so. We'll also invite you to please consider joining our YouTube channel, becoming a member. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from, and depending on which level you select, you can gain access to bonus video features. And you'll be supporting our coverage, helping us continue to bring you live events like this one from Florida Space Coast, and our wider coverage of the wider space industry around the world and around the U.S. on spaceflightnow.com. So our memberships here on YouTube help drive our coverage, help us continue to do what we do. Please consider supporting us in that way. You can also support our coverage and contribute through the Super Chat function here on YouTube. We'd appreciate that greatly as well. And we want to thank those of you who have already become members and have already contributed to our coverage. We really appreciate it. Now T-minus 32 minutes, 10 seconds and counting. T-minus 31 minutes, 10 seconds. The two satellites on board tonight's mission are owned by Intelsat, one of the world's largest operators of commercial geostationary communications satellites. These satellites are named Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34. And here you see an image provided to us by Intelsat showing these two satellites stacked one on top of the other in launch configuration. These are what these satellites look like right now inside the payload fairing, that 5.2 diameter.
Stage 1 cryohelium load has started.
That 5.2 meter diameter payload fairing out on pad 40. These two satellites are buttoned up inside that nose cone right now in this stacked dual launch configuration. The entire stack weighs about 7.3 metric tons. That's about 16,200 pounds. And each of these satellites weighs about 8,000 pounds or so. Galaxy 33, on top of the stack, will be separated first after launching into what's known as a subsynchronous transfer orbit. This is an elliptical transfer orbit that has an apogee or high point just shy of geosynchronous altitude at 22,000 miles. So it'll be somewhat below 22,000 miles at the high point of its orbit when it comes off the Falcon 9. That deployment is scheduled about 33 minutes after launch. They'll be released by firing a pyrotechnic release device and a clamp band that connects those two satellites. and then Galaxy 34 will be the second and final payload deployed this evening at about T+38 minutes. These pictures were taken inside the payload processing facility that SpaceX operates here at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This view shows a nice shot of the two satellites with their deployable antenna reflectors. Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 are primarily C-band satellites. They'll be providing video broadcast services for cable TV operators across North America. And Galaxy 33 is going to be replacing, these two satellites are both going to be replacing aging satellites in Intelsat's fleet that have been in space for 17 years in one case and 19 years in another case. That these satellites have outlived their lifetimes. And so these two satellites are going to orbit tonight to replace them. And these two satellites are also part of what is known as the C-band clearing program. The Federal Communications Commission a couple of years ago decided to repurpose part of the C-band spectrum, some of the C-band frequencies from satellite transmissions to 5G terrestrial transmissions for mobile wireless services. And that required satellite operators like Intelsat and SES to order new satellites that are reconfigured, properly configured to operate at this higher frequency band within the C-band spectrum. And these two satellites will go into orbit as part of that program, as part of a multi-billion-dollar program that Intelsat and one of the other large telecom operators, satellite telecom operators, SES, are now pursuing. We saw two satellites launched by SES earlier this week on board a ULA Atlas V rocket with a very similar mission to these two satellites for Intelsat that are going to space tonight aboard SpaceX's Falcon 9. We had an opportunity to talk with an official from Intelsat earlier today. Jean-Luc Freliger is the Senior Vice President for Space Systems at Intelsat, and he talked to us a little bit about the two Galaxy satellites going to orbit tonight, Galaxy 33 and 34. So here's our chat with Jean-Luc Freliger from Intelsat earlier today. Okay, Jean-Luc, thanks for joining us for our coverage of the launch of Galaxy 33 and 34. Can you talk a little bit about what these satellites are going to be doing?
So those two satellites, Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34, are part of our Galaxy fleet covering North America. So they are primarily media satellites. They'll be replacing existing satellites. Galaxy 33 is replacing Galaxy 15. Galaxy 34 is replacing Galaxy 12. Those two satellites are part of a 7 C-band satellites buy that we did in 2020. And those 7 satellites are not only replacing existing Galaxy satellites for our North American media customers, but they're also helping clearing the lower end of the C-band spectrum over the United States. So very, very important satellites for us.
And after launch, after these satellites separate from the Falcon 9 rocket, can you speak to us about what the testing is going to be like, what the orbit raising is going to be like to get those from subsynchronous transfer orbit to GEO?
Yes, so as you mentioned, those satellites will be placed into a subsynchronous transfer orbit, meaning that the apogee will be lower than the geostationary altitude. So the first thing that will happen is separation from the launch vehicle. Those two satellites are stacked together. So the upper satellite, Galaxy 33, is going to separate from the lower satellites. And then about 8 minutes later, the lower satellites, Galaxy 34, is going to separate from the launch vehicle. Over the next 2 weeks, those satellites will perform a series of maneuvers. First, perigee maneuvers to help increase the apogee height all the way to GEO, and then apogee maneuvers to help increase the perigee height to GEO. Once we are at GEO orbit, we'll deploy reflectors, solar array, and perform in-orbit tests. The first satellite, Galaxy 33, will enter service in early November. The second satellite, Galaxy 34, will enter service in early December.
For those of us who watch cable TV, can you give a few examples of the type of programming these C-band satellites are providing?
So again, media customer, North America, all brand names, HBO, Discovery, Disney channels, Diamond Sports Network, Stars. Those are some names that will be using our Galaxy fleet or are using our Galaxy fleet.
And this launch tonight is flying on a SpaceX first stage booster, launching for the 14th time. And this is actually the third SpaceX launch this week. Can you talk about your confidence in SpaceX and confidence flying on a booster that's flown so many times before?
So we're extremely confident with SpaceX, and that's why we contracted with them, not only for this launch, but for future launches as well. You are right that the first stage is going to fly for the 14th time, but we looked at all the data. We're very confident. And by the way, SpaceX has flown this first stage booster even more times than 14 times for some of their own missions.
And I think you'll be back in a few weeks or about a month or so for another launch with SpaceX. Can you talk about that mission a little bit and the rest of your C-band satellites, when they're going to be deployed?
Yeah. So of the 7 C-band satellites that we procured, 6 satellites are going to be launched between now and the end of the year. Each time they will be launched in pairs. So the first pair tonight, Galaxy 33, 34, Falcon 9 SpaceX, reusable launch vehicle. We'll be back next month in early November for the next launch, Galaxy 31 and 32. Those satellites have been manufactured by Maxar, and this will be an expandable Falcon 9 booster, having a little more performance for those heavier satellites. Then we have a third launch of a pair, Galaxy 35 and 36, that will be done from French Guiana. And they will be back next year for a 7 C-band satellite launch, Galaxy 37 for another Falcon 9 launch.
Jean-Luc, thank you for your time and good luck with the mission.
Thank you.
That was Jean-Luc Froliger, the Senior Vice President for Space Systems at Intelsat, the customer for tonight's dedicated Falcon 9 launch, carrying these 2 video broadcasting satellites into orbit. These satellites are named Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34. They're built by Northrop Grumman, and they're launched in a dual-stacked configuration. As you can see in this image from the clean room payload processing facility, you can see the 2 satellites stacked one on top of the other. And this artist concept provided by Intelsat shows what these satellites will look like once they are in orbit and they unfurl their solar panels and deploy their reflector antennas. Galaxy 33 has a C-band payload as well as a small Ku and Ka band communications payload, and Galaxy 34 is a dedicated dedicated C-band satellite providing video broadcast services for cable TV, as we heard Jean-Luc talk about a few moments ago. Now T-minus 22 minutes and 20 seconds. In a couple of minutes, we expect to see the so-called big vent from the strong back out at pad 40. We're going to go back to a full screen shot of pad 40 now. It's a beautiful evening here on Florida Space Coast. You can see some of the sun glinting from sunset on the Falcon 9 rocket right now out at pad 40. Everything on track for liftoff at 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 23:20 UTC. This is the 46th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket this year and the 3rd Falcon 9 launch in just 31 hours.
Stage 1, Pogo. Stage 2 RP1 load is complete.
T-minus 20 minutes and counting. We're now seeing that big vent I mentioned a couple of moments ago. This is a vent of oxygen gas that is coming out of the strong back associated with the start of chill down of liquid oxygen loading lines that actually run the height of that strong back in order to load that oxidizer into the second stage of the Falcon 9. This is a thermal conditioning process before the second stage of the Falcon 9 is actually loaded with liquid oxygen beginning in a few minutes. We talked about the start of propellant load at T-minus 35 minutes. At that point, only 3 of the 4 tanks on the Falcon 9 actually began receiving their propellant supply. The kerosene and liquid oxygen tank on the first stage was loaded beginning at T-minus 35 minutes, as well as the kerosene fuel tank on stage 2. We heard a call a couple of minutes ago that the kerosene tank on stage 2 is now fully loaded, right on time. And now attention on the stage 2 propulsion system, propellant system will begin to focus on loading of liquid oxygen. T-minus 18 minutes and 50 seconds. That liquid oxygen load on stage 2 should begin in a little more than 2 minutes' time.
Stage 2 LOX load has begun.
T-minus 16 minutes, 10 seconds and counting. We just heard that call from SpaceX Launch Control that the stage 2 LOX load has begun. So this is the liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage that is now getting underway. The final propellant tank to be filled this evening. In parallel with this propellant loading operation is the loading of helium pressurant on board the vehicle. This is cryogenic helium that is used to maintain pressure inside the propellant tanks as the Falcon 9's engines consume kerosene and liquid oxygen during today's launch. T-minus 15 minutes and 33 seconds. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 remains set for 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 23:20 UTC, with Galaxy 33 and 34, 2 Intelsat commercial communications satellites. A beautiful evening, as I've mentioned before. No weather concerns to speak of right now. Light winds, clear skies. This could be a very spectacular launch occurring about 15 to 20 minutes after sunset here on Florida Space Coast.
spacecraft on internal power.
T-minus 14 minutes, 20 seconds. Here's a look at some of the countdown milestones this evening. We've already passed a couple of these. At T-minus 35 minutes was the start of the countdown auto sequence, where the computer takes control of the countdown. The ground computer takes control of the countdown. And that was also the point at which SpaceX began loading 1 million pounds of propellant on board the Falcon 9. At T-minus 20 minutes or so, we heard confirmation that the second stage kerosene tank was full, and chill down of the liquid oxygen loading lines began at the same time. And then at T-minus 16 minutes, we heard confirmation that liquid oxygen loading was underway on stage 2. Looking ahead for the remainder of the countdown, at T-minus 7 minutes, engine chill down will begin. This is when the Merlin 1D engines at the bottom of the Falcon 9's first stage booster will begin to be thermally conditioned for flight by flowing a little bit of cryogenic liquid oxygen through that engine section to condition those components for ignition. At T-minus 5 minutes and 30 seconds approximately, the kerosene tank on stage 1 should be fully loaded. At T-minus 4 minutes 30 seconds, we'll see the strong back just to the right of the vehicle in this view begin to recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle. And then at T-minus 3 minutes, we should hear confirmation that liquid oxygen load on stage 1 is complete. At T-minus 2 minutes, we'll hear the same call for the completion of liquid oxygen load on stage 2. And at T-minus 1 minute, the onboard computer on the Falcon 9 rocket itself will take command of the countdown, and the Falcon 9 will be on internal power at that point as well. And the vent valves on the propellant tanks will be closed to allow those tanks to pressurize to flight levels. And at T-minus 45 seconds, the launch director will verify their go for liftoff. And at T-minus 3 seconds, the Merlin engine ignition sequence will begin. This is using an igniter fluid called a TTEB, triethyl aluminum triethyl borane, that is used to ignite these 9 Merlin engines clustered at the bottom of the first stage booster. And at T0, if everything looks good, hold down clamps will release to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb off the pad. Here's a view of the trajectory for tonight's mission. This launch is heading toward an equatorial geosynchronous orbit ultimately. So that means it needs to head due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This red line shows the approximate ground track out over the Atlantic Ocean. We've labeled the location of Space Launch Complex 40, the departure point for tonight's flight, as well as the location of the drone ship, which is named as Shortfall of Gravitas, holding position about 400 miles or about 640 kilometers downrange. That's where the first stage booster will target landing less than 9 minutes after liftoff this evening. Again, this is heading into a what's known as a subsynchronous transfer orbit. It's a highly elliptical orbit, oval-shaped orbit with an apogee a few thousand miles above the Earth, but short of geosynchronous altitude, which is 22,000 miles. And these two satellites will use their onboard propulsion to raise their orbit, circularize their orbit to 22,000 miles. And at that altitude over the equator, they'll be orbiting in lockstep with Earth's rotation, giving these two satellites a fixed coverage zone over North America for their video broadcast services. Here's a quick look at the launch timeline. After liftoff, it'll take about 50 seconds or so for the Falcon 9 rocket to go supersonic. The first stage booster will burn for 2.5 minutes. At that point, we'll see the booster separate to begin its descent back toward the drone ship. And the second stage will take over for an initial burn to place these two satellites into a low-altitude parking orbit. And then a second burn is scheduled about T plus 26 minutes and 19 seconds. That'll be a burn lasting about 50 seconds. And that burn will actually propel the satellites into their final deployment orbit several thousand miles above the Earth. And then we'll see Galaxy 33 deploy from the Falcon 9 at T plus 33 minutes, followed about 5 minutes later by Galaxy 34 separation. So now T minus 10 minutes and T-minus 10 minutes and 5 seconds and counting. So that's a quick overview of what to expect over the course of the evening. This is about a 38-minute flight from liftoff until the final payload deployment, and launch is now less than 10 minutes away. Now inside of 9 minutes until launch. In our interview with Jean-Luc Froliger from Intelsat a few minutes ago, we mentioned that this is the 14th flight of this particular Falcon 9 first stage booster. And here's a look at the flight history for this booster, which is known as Booster 1060. This booster has been in SpaceX's fleet for more than 2 years. It debuted back on June the 30th of 2020 with a GPS launch. And since then, you can see this list of missions. It's flown 13 times in total. Most recently, it launched a Starlink satellite delivery flight back on June the 17th of this year, about 4 months ago, and has now been refurbished for its 14th flight going to space today. This will be the second booster that SpaceX has in its fleet that has reached the 14-flight milestone, but it's the first time SpaceX has used a booster that's flying for more than 10 flights on a dedicated customer mission. Again, this mission is for Intelsat. It's not carrying SpaceX's own Starlink internet satellites into orbit. This is a customer mission, but we've heard from Jean-Luc Froliger and other Intelsat officials that they're confident in this vehicle, and it's going to be tied for the fleet leader in SpaceX's inventory of reusable boosters after tonight's flight.
Ready.
Now inside of 7 minutes until launch
Engine
at this
chill
point,
has started.
the engine chill down is getting underway. This is the thermal conditioning of the Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the Falcon 9's first stage. Again, this involves flowing a little bit of liquid oxygen, which is chilled several hundred degrees below zero, into that engine compartment to condition the engines, pumps, and other components for the more rapid flow of oxidizer at engine startup. Here's a look at the trajectory. This graphic is actually provided by SpaceX, showing a generic trajectory for a mission like tonight's, with the first stage booster heading for the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, again holding position a few hundred miles east of Cape Canaveral tonight. You can see the booster after separation 2.5 minutes after liftoff will flip using cold gas thrusters to a tail first orientation. It'll perform an entry burn and then perform a final landing burn with the
Stage
help
1
of
RP1 load has completed.
with the help of grid fins, and then it'll deploy landing legs just before touchdown, a vertical landing on the drone ship. All this will be happening as the second stage continues into orbit.
Falcon 9 tanks are pressurizing for Stromback retract.
Stromback retract in progress.
T-minus 4 minutes, 15 seconds. We've heard a call a few moments ago that the first stage is now fully loaded with kerosene fuel. So about 46,000 gallons of kerosene fuel has now been loaded into both stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. T-minus 4 minutes and counting. The Stromback, that's the mast to the right of the vehicle in this view, is now retracting to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. This is the point at which it will hold for the remainder of the countdown, and then at liftoff it'll begin a more rapid recline to allow the 23-story Falcon 9 to begin its climb off the pad. T-minus 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The next major milestones in the countdown will be the securing of the liquid oxygen loading, first on stage 1, then on stage 2. Also at this point, the autonomous flight safety system should be configured for flight. This is the range safety destruct system that would be used to terminate the mission, essentially blow up the rocket if it veered off course after liftoff. T-minus 3 minutes, 15 seconds. A beautiful evening here on Florida's Space Coast. Weather continues to be ideal for launch of a Falcon 9 rocket at 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
T-minus 2 minutes, 22 seconds. We've heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the stage 1 liquid oxygen load is complete. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. Again, if you're just joining us, if you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. We want to get as many people watching our coverage as possible for what is shaping up to be a spectacular twilight launch from Cape
Stage
Canaveral.
2 LOX load is complete.
And we've heard second stage liquid oxygen load is complete, so SpaceX now has about 1 million pounds of propellant on the vehicle. The entire Falcon 9 in its fully loaded state weighs about 1.2 million pounds. The 9 Merlin engines that will be propelling it off the ground tonight will produce 1.7 million pounds of thrust at full throttle. T-minus 80 seconds and counting. T-minus 70 seconds. At T-minus 60 seconds, the Falcon 9 will transition into startup. It will transition to internal battery power. And at that point, the Falcon 9's onboard computer will be controlling the rest of the countdown.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
T-minus 50 seconds. We'll stand by for the final go for launch from SpaceX's launch director. Should be coming momentarily.
Go for launch.
T-minus 30 seconds. And we have an abort. Countdown has stopped at about T-minus 30 seconds. Again, the countdown has stopped at about T-minus 30 seconds. So liftoff will not be happening as scheduled at 7:20 p.m. We'll stand by for any word from SpaceX on what may have caused the abort. SpaceX does have a launch window extending until 8:14 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, but it's not likely that SpaceX will be able to recycle this countdown and still have a go for launch tonight, just based on propellant conditioning constraints that SpaceX has with this densified propellant. But we'll wait for that official word from SpaceX on their plan forward for this evening. see the countdown clock remains in this hold at T-minus 30 seconds. We haven't heard anything official yet from SpaceX on the reason for this abort, whether it was a technical issue with the launch vehicle or perhaps a range constraint. Of course, we know the weather, at least here on the surface, is near perfect for launch this evening, although we're not sure of the latest upper level wind conditions. We're now showing a view from SpaceX's webcast, a different angle of Pad 40, as we wait for an update from the launch provider on the reason for this abort and whether the teams will be able to make another run at liftoff tonight. About 50 minutes remaining in tonight's launch window, which closes at 8:14 p.m. Eastern Time. We've seen SpaceX try to recycle when they have a couple of hours of launch window, but we haven't seen them been able to recycle and set up for another terminal countdown in less than an hour, which is what the condition is, what the situation is tonight, with the launch window closing in about 50 minutes. Without calling a scrub. SpaceX has officially scrubbed tonight's launch attempt. Again, the launch aborted at T-minus 30 seconds. This was an automatic abort commanded by the Falcon 9's onboard computer, which governs the final 60 seconds of the countdown. SpaceX has another launch opportunity on the range for tomorrow night at 7:06 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:06 UTC. But we'll see what the reason was for this scrub this evening before SpaceX officially determines whether they'll make another run at launch tomorrow. But we've heard confirmation now that the launch will not be happening tonight, according to SpaceX. This is a scrub for the evening, and the next opportunity will be tomorrow at 7:06 p.m. Eastern Time to launch the Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 communications satellites for Intelsat from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida.
We had a launch abort tonight at T-minus 30 seconds. The abort was triggered by flight computer, identified higher than expected first stage cryo-helium decay. We'll investigate that. We're setting up for a 24-hour recycle, and we'll make our next attempt here Friday evening.
That was the voice of SpaceX's launch director giving us a little bit more information on the reason for this hold tonight. The Falcon 9's onboard computer commanded an automatic abort at T-minus 30 seconds when it detected a higher than expected decay rate in a first stage cryo-helium system. This helium is a pressurant that's used to maintain pressure in the propellant tanks of the Falcon 9 rocket in flight, and this is also used to pressurize those tanks to flight levels in the final 60 seconds of the countdown, so that may have been what it was happening at about that T-minus 30 second point. SpaceX's launch director said the team will be investigating this issue, but right now they're setting up for another launch attempt tomorrow evening at 7:06 p.m. Eastern Time, 23:06 UTC. That's when the launch window opens, 1 minute earlier than the window open for tonight's launch opportunity. To recap, we were here covering the scheduled launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket tonight with Intelsat's Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 video broadcasting satellites. However, that launch did not happen. There was an automatic abort triggered at T-minus 30 seconds due to what SpaceX's launch director reported was a higher than expected pressure decay rate in the first stage helium system. That will be investigated over the course of the night, and right now SpaceX is setting up for another launch opportunity for this rocket tomorrow at 7:06 p.m. That is 23:06 UTC, about 24 hours later than the start of tonight's launch window. And the weather tomorrow looks very similar to today, with a very good chance of favorable weather. So we'll hope that holds, and we'll be back tomorrow here at Kennedy Space Center for live coverage of the countdown beginning around 6 p.m. Eastern Time for this scheduled 7:06 p.m. liftoff time for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with the Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 communication satellites. I'm Stephen Clark. I've been reporting live from Kennedy Space Center. We'll be back again tomorrow, as I said. Have a great evening.